All right, we'll get going. Thanks, everybody. It's great to see so many people come back. I know there's lots of people wandering around, all the commotion, so it's really great to see folks coming back for the last bit of the day. My name is Doug Poston, and I'll be moderating the session. I'm the Executive Director of End Homelessness St. John's and a member of the CAH Board of Directors. So if you have any comments, questions, or concerns about the event, let myself know or any of the board members know as well. I'm excited to moderate a panel, I suppose. I'm really looking forward to our participants who are speaking around community responses to unsheltered homelessness. This is a big issue everywhere. It's growing here in Atlantic Canada, so really looking forward to our presenters today. I'm joined today by the following presenters: Michelle Roberts with Infrastructure Canada, who will present on community responses to homeless encampments in Canada. Mary Ellen Glover and Brooke Mills with the City of Vancouver, and they're joined by Kevin Eaton with Luama Natives Housing Society, and they'll present on their learnings from Vancouver on the tiny shelter village. And then if anybody's looking for information about our presenters, there's bios on the app and on the website, so you can check out the presenters on that. Each presentation will take about 30 minutes, just to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to get to present. And rather than having questions at the end of each presentation, we'll save about 20 to 30 minutes at the very end for presenters, questions for our presenters. So with that, I'll pass it over.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's great to see that everyone's come back. It was a slightly jarring thing to happen right before I was meant to present, to have a fire in the building, but we're good now. Okay, so yeah, I hope everyone is having a good afternoon otherwise. My name is Michelle Roberts. I'm a policy analyst at the Homelessness Policy Directorate at Infrastructure Canada. I conduct data analysis of administrative shelter data, and I support research projects related to reducing and measuring homelessness in Canada. So today I'd like to present the findings from the 2022 National Survey on Homeless Encampments, which were published on the Infrastructure Canada website earlier this week, actually. First, I will give some background information on the development and distribution of the survey, and then I'll jump straight into the analysis of the results for each of the major themes that were covered in the survey. So the 2022 National Survey on Homeless Encampments was developed to address a data gap within the federal government, as our existing sources, including HIFIS and pit count data, provide insufficient insight into the prevalence and experiences of unsheltered homelessness, and specifically encampment homelessness, across at a national scale. Communities across Canada reported an increase in homeless encampments over the past few years, and this likely reflects a complex set of factors associated with the pandemic, including the strain on public health care and social services systems, the challenging housing market, the economic contraction in 2020 and the subsequent increase in the cost of living, and the persistence of chronic homelessness. Following a literature review, the survey was composed around three key themes: the current status and recent trends of encampment homelessness, perceived drivers of encampment use rather than shelter use, and community responses. The final theme explores types of responses, resources for and barriers to responding, and the perceived effectiveness of strategies employed. In October of 2022, Infrastructure Canada distributed the National Survey online to community entity representatives from all four funding streams under Reaching Home. In January 2023, the Ministry of Health and Social Sciences coordinated survey distribution and data collection to community representatives in the province of Quebec. In total, 112 representatives from 94 unique communities were invited to participate in the survey. INFC received responses from 72 unique communities, representing a 77% response rate. Using Statistics Canada classifications based on population size and density and/or the presence of a downtown core, each community was categorized as either urban or rural. So of the 72 communities that responded, 35 were classified as urban and 37 were rural. Communities with more than one official representative were invited to work together on a single survey or to submit responses independently from one another. In total, 75 responses were received as 3 representatives from 3 communities submitted 2 responses each from 2 representatives. So first, I'm going to give an overview of the reported prevalence and characteristics of encampments in 2022 and also since the beginning of the pandemic. 68 out of the 72 communities responding to the survey reported having current or historical homeless encampments. 2 communities indicated that there was no history of encampment use in their community, and 2 indicated that they were unsure. The findings in this presentation reflect responses from 71 survey respondents in 68 communities. Almost 2/3 of respondents reported regularly tracking information on the number and size of encampments. And urban respondents were almost twice as likely as rural respondents to report regularly collecting data on encampments. In the 37 communities that reported both their estimated homeless population and rates of encampment use, the average estimated proportion of the homeless population staying in encampments was between 14% to 23%. This is consistent with the findings from the most recent 2020-2022 PIT count, where 25% of people experiencing homelessness on a given night were enumerated in unsheltered locations, including encampments. Almost 2/3 of almost 2/3 of communities reported having small encampments with 10 people or less. About 1/3 reported having mid-sized encampments, and approximately 10% of communities reported having large encampments of 50 or more people. Small encampments were also more numerous, with a median of 10 small encampments per community, excluding non-responses. And in some cases, over 100 small encampments were reported within a single community. Small encampments were similarly likely to appear in both urban and rural communities. However, urban communities were over 50% more likely than rural communities to report mid-sized encampments, and all reports of large encampments originated from urban communities. Despite larger encampment sizes in urban communities, rural communities were more likely to report higher rates of overall encampment use relative to the total homeless population. So about 1/3 of the rural homeless population were reportedly staying in encampments versus less than 1/4 of the urban homeless population. 2/3 of respondents reported that the majority of encampments were located in the more central or densely populated areas of their community. And of these, it was slightly more common that the majority of encampments were out of sight of the general public, for example, on abandoned properties or near waterways, rather than in plain sight of the general public, for example, in a town square or on a major boulevard. However, other locations were also reported peripherally in rural areas, outskirts of urban areas, and private or government-owned property. And almost 3/4 of respondents reported 3 or more location types where encampments exist in their community. About 2/3 of respondents reported a decrease in the population size or number of encampments during colder months. Encampment use tended to be more affected by seasonal changes in rural communities, which were more likely to report significant decreases. Since the beginning of the pandemic, 75% of respondents reported increases in the population size of encampments, and 80% reported increases in the number of encampments in their community. 63% of respondents indicated that one or both of these measures increased significantly, and the increase was most pronounced in urban communities. Addressing homelessness in encampments has become a higher priority since the pandemic started among both the local homeless serving sectors and the general public. However, within a given community, the reported concerns tended on average to shift more drastically among the general public than within the sector. And this is partly potentially attributable to the effects of the pandemic, namely that encampments may have become more visible to the public in some communities, or that workers in the sector may have observed that the general public has been more vocal in expressing concerns about encampments through print, social media, and public forums in recent years. Now we will dig into some of the perceived factors contributing to encampment use. Using a Likert scale ranking, the key reasons why people were staying in encampments instead of using the local shelter systems were restrictive rules and eligibility criteria at shelters, shelters being at or over capacity, and safety and security concerns in shelters. Shelter type or bed availability not matching family makeup, and a lack of privacy, autonomy, dignity, and respect at shelters were also commonly reported as contributing factors. The top 5 contributors of encampment usage hold true for both urban and rural communities, though the order of these factors varies slightly. The single most significant contributor of encampment use for urban communities is restrictive rules and eligibility criteria at shelters, whereas the top driver of encampment use in rural communities is that shelters are at or over capacity. In some cases, respondents identified additional drivers of encampment use outside of those presented in the survey, including a lack of affordable, safe, stable, and suitable housing, reported by 37% of respondents voluntarily via comments, and local mental health or addictions crises, reported by 32% of respondents. And since these findings are based only on voluntary comments that explicitly referenced these issues, the impact of these factors is likely underestimated. And there are also a lot of comments that tangentially refer to, say, addictions, mental health crises, without mentioning them explicitly. So essentially, we've seen that the perceived drivers of encampments are rooted in the system capacity being overwhelmed in terms of shelter space and also in terms of shelter and housing appropriateness and accessibility. And we're seeing influences from throughout the housing continuum, healthcare, and legal systems. Next, we will explore the characteristics of community responses. The most commonly reported community responses to encampments were to close or clear out encampments with temporary support offered to residents to aid a transition to shelter or housing, or to tacitly accept encampment use, which could also be described as lack of enforcement or non-intervention, followed by closing or clearing out encampments with long-term support offered to residents. However, we don't have more specific data on the duration of support or what that support consists of, leading to some ambiguity interpreting this result. Communities with larger encampments were less likely to report offering long-term support upon encampment closure. Conversely, communities with larger encampments were more likely to practice tacit acceptance. 8% of communities, mostly urban, reported establishing formally sanctioned encampments. And 28% of communities reported clearing out encampments with little or no notice or support offered to residents. The most commonly reported factor influencing a community's encampment response was concern for the health and safety of encampment residents, followed by visibility to the general public and reports and complaints to municipal government staff, emergency services, and elected officials. If we aggregate responses, complaints from housed people become the most prevalent factor, influencing how over 80% of communities make and implement their decisions. Just over a quarter of respondents reported having an official encampment response plan with protocols in place in their community. It was more common for communities to have unofficial agreements among partners on protocols or to formulate their responses on a case-by-case basis. Community responses were most commonly carried out by frontline service providers and by the police. Encampment residents were the least commonly reported as active participants in responses. Some respondents reported offering on-site or on-call services and facilities for encampment residents in a thorough and consistent manner, such as healthcare, heating, storage, food service, or sanitation services. The majority of respondents reported that the services offered were basic or inconsistent over time. Next, we will discuss some of the resources available to support encampment responses, and notably the barriers faced within communities in developing and implementing responses. The most common funding sources for encampment responses were federal funding from the Reaching Home program, followed by homelessness-specific provincial funding and municipal funding. Urban respondents were more likely than rural respondents to have access to funding from any given source. Based on Likert scale scoring, the key barriers to responding to encampment since the beginning of the pandemic were lack of staff and lack of funding. Lack of guidance or support with response development, lack of data on encampment use, and lack of community partner collaboration were less commonly reported as barriers, but were still considerable challenges. And the above factors all tended to be reported as greater barriers in rural areas, with the exception of lack of staff, which was reported as a greater barrier in urban areas. Comments also provided further details to contextualize responses to the closed-ended survey question on barriers. For example, some respondents commented on the challenges associated with inconsistent or unpredictable funding, ineffectively allocated funding, or funding that is inconsiderate of inflation. Staffing challenges not only included understaffing, but lack of qualified staff, high burnout and turnover rates, lack of relevant or standardized training, lack of measures to ensure worker safety and well-being, and reliance on volunteers. Respondents also identified additional barriers to reducing encampments, including the impacts of local attitudes and perceptions, reported by 38% of respondents via comments. These include political inertia and inconsistency or unresponsiveness from leadership, racism, harassment, stigma, and discrimination against individuals experiencing homelessness, enforcement-type punitive responses or criminalization of homelessness, interference from third parties, and lack of clear responsibilities or authorities. And furthermore, controversy regarding the general philosophies or best practices was reported to result in some communities in the simultaneous employment of conflicting initiatives or inaction due to lack of consensus. And finally, lack of trust rebuilding between institutions, staff, and individuals experiencing homelessness was noted by some respondents as a barrier that was liable to perpetuate marginalization, displacement, and underutilization of services. Approximately 20% of respondents also commented that there was a lack of system capacity to adequately respond to the needs and interests of high acuity populations, including those experiencing chronic homelessness. Respondents indicated that these limitations persist throughout the continuum of homelessness services, including outreach, shelter entry, case management, housing, wraparound supports and follow-up. And other infrastructural issues included low accessibility in rural areas where services are few and far between, and challenges in technology integration. Respondents indicated that barriers exacerbate each other, compounding their effect on the efficacy of attempts to address encampments. They cited several interdependent discrete problems and systemic gaps causing bottlenecks in service provision. For example, barriers related to funding can affect an organization's capacity to address their staffing or data-related issues, which may in turn hinder the ability to collaborate with partners. Overall, the barriers span from operational to institutional. Finally, I'll go over some of the reported success rates of strategies that have been employed by communities and future strategies that they have planned. The strategies most commonly implemented by communities were increasing coordination amongst service providers, referrals to shelter or housing programs, increasing outreach activities, and harm reduction services. The community response strategies most likely to succeed in reducing encampment numbers were creating new shelters, increasing availability of public or transitional housing, increasing capacity in existing shelters, and creating or transitioning to low-barrier shelters. Rates of success should be interpreted in the context that costs, quality, scope, and duration of strategies employed may impact their feasibility and effectiveness. The sufficient conditions for success are obscure, and the metrics of success that we use in this case, nominal reduction of encampment users, doesn't capture nuance in terms of actual well-being. breaking down the sample population by community characteristics to analyze the necessary conditions for success did not return statistically significant results due to small subsample sizes and the incidence of non-responses. But some successful strategies reported via comments included creating more housing-focused outreach positions and hiring people with lived experience of encampment homelessness to provide peer support and guidance and fill leadership roles, leveraging their existing relationships and local knowledge of how to reach people, where to find them, and what services or resources they need. Establishing local working groups or communities of practice between bylaw authorities, municipal park staff, public health, frontline service providers, and service users was also noted as a necessary step in systems transformation and establishing more centralized monitoring frameworks. Integrating health and housing systems and sharing low-barrier protocols, including trauma-informed practices and harm reduction, was reported to be helpful at avoiding repeated transitions between organizations and to increase the success of supportive housing. Otherwise, communities cited centralizing their referral systems, implementing outdoor sheltering strategies, warming centers, portable outreach community hubs, culturally appropriate supports for Indigenous people, and measures to uphold the right to self-determination that were also mentioned as successful and intrinsic strategies to reducing encampment homelessness. Respondents also noted the importance of anti-stigma campaigns to raise public awareness of encampments and to increase sensitivity, as well as steps to decriminalize homelessness, including public statements by local police authorities to this effect. They reported that public concerns are often centered on visibility, disruptions to local businesses, or other anti-homeless sentiments or misinformed perceptions, and that they would like to see resources going to address those. The most commonly reported strategies planned to be implemented by communities within the next 6 to 12 months were increasing affordable housing supply and/or supportive and transitional housing, increasing shelter capacity, increasing outreach capacity, engaging with encampment residents, and partnership building with relevant actors. So we got a lot of really detailed information from community representatives about what's happening. A considerable portion of the homeless population are staying in encampments, and encampment use has been growing since the pandemic started. We've learned that there are supply-side issues for affordable housing and homelessness services in terms of both quantity and quality. Inaccessible and exclusionary shelters, full or overcrowded shelters, or unsafe shelters are causing people to have no other recourse than staying in encampments. Mitigating these shortages of housing and shelter capacity, as well as implementing low-barrier policies to make programs more accessible and inclusive, have shown promise in reducing encampment homelessness. However, there are significant obstacles, of which funding is a big part. Just over a quarter of communities have an official encampment response plan with protocols in place, and respondents reported challenges achieving consensus and establishing a cohesive response. In the absence of guidance from suitable authorities and sufficient staffing, some communities reported the employment of enforcement-type responses, tacit acceptance, or various conflicting initiatives at turns. We've observed that police are actively involved in most encampment responses, but encampment residents themselves were least likely to be reported as actively involved, and the quality of that engagement remains unclear. In fact, complaints from housed people rival health and safety concerns of encampment residents in determining how communities will respond. Our results show that the issue is not just about resources, it's about attitudes. And these are some questions that the process of working on this report kind of brought up for me. So when it is time for discussion, I would be interested in hearing from you all, learning from your insights, and I'd be interested in bringing information and ideas back to the federal government to inform future activities as possible. That's it.
Thank you.
Oh, and sorry, I also have my contact information and contact information for the general inbox.
Great, thank you very much, Michelle. It's really, really informative. I guess at this point, I'll ask our second presenters to come up. Brooke and Kevin, Mary Ellen. I don't know, yeah, you have yours on.
Yes, I'm
So I'll
getting
just-
it to
I'll do my best.
the view screen.
Yeah, okay, I can do that for you.
Okay.
Yeah, and you're going first.
Yes, I'm going first. I can pick them up. There we go. Let me get to the view.
There you go.
That's the view screen.
Just slide one. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you all for choosing our session this afternoon. I know this can be a hard time of day if you've traveled, so appreciate the attendance. So my name is Brooke, Mary Ellen, Kevin. So we'll be doing a joint presentation. Before we kick off, we'd like to acknowledge that we are visitors today and for the rest of the week here on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq peoples. And so we hope to learn and just be engaged and thank them for their stewardship of the land. We'd also like to share that we have come here today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in Vancouver. So as a response to unsheltered homelessness that Michelle spoke about, our goal today is just to really share our learnings so far. Whether you work for local government or a nonprofit, we'd like to send you home with some thoughts about our learnings, our process, in the event that this is a tool that you'd like to use in your community. Basically, we're going to tell you a little story of how this has gone. And I'll kick off, and then I'll pass it on to Mary Ellen. I just want to note also, any of the pictures that you see here are actually from our tiny shelter pilot program. And if you have questions, well, we'll be happy to answer. Okay, so how did we get here? In late 2020, our city council tasked staff to go explore this idea of tiny shelters, tiny homes, as another tool as a response to homelessness within the city of Vancouver. So late 2020, council passed a motion. Staff were asked to do some work around looking at reviewing next steps, ideas. In 2021, we did what was called a market sounding to just gain ideas from community around what could be feasible options for us. So there was a fair bit of interest in that market sounding process, and so then we went on to basically write a report to council and recommend that we move forward with a tiny shelter pilot program within the city of Vancouver. Now, this would be the first within the city of Vancouver, led by the city. So that report was approved in February of 2022, and off we went to start our work. I just want to take a second. We often hear the terms tiny shelter, tiny homes used interchangeably, but we really wanted to make a conscious decision to speak of this as tiny shelters. They are not, the plan was to do 100 square foot structures. They don't have washrooms or little kitchenettes. It's sleeping quarters, space for storage, and shelving, and we'll get into the design features a little bit later. But just wanted to make that distinction, and folks are not paying rent as well. So tiny shelters is where we landed. So in terms of who this model would serve, you've heard a lot already from Michelle. We need to make sure we have a low barrier model. It was really important for us in Vancouver, given some history with encampments, reaching people who are not accessing the congregate shelters. So we know couples famously would like to be together and don't have those opportunities in the congregate shelters in Vancouver in terms of sleeping quarters. We want to also include non-romantic couples in terms of who is camping outdoors. We see family kin, we see street family, folks who are trans and gender diverse or transitioning and don't necessarily feel safe in the existing options. So, and then of course, we added a couple of accessibility units for anyone who may need an increased level of privacy given health or accessibility issues. So, further on the project vision, we really want to build on an existing partnership that the city has and the province has with LUMA Native Housing Society. So Kevin's here. We'll talk about our collaboration. We already have a long-term partnership at a city-owned site where LUMA runs a shelter. Strong collaboration we felt was key to this pilot, given it's a pilot. You all know how that can go. And we wanted to also build on using existing resources to add capacity. And there's a large underutilized space at this shelter by way of a parking lot. Okay, so that sets us up for a little bit about the process, and I'm going to pass it on to Mary Ellen.
Hi. Well, it's certainly been a process, so we definitely encourage folks to reach out to us. We'll have our contact information at the end, but just as Brooke said, it's a story to tell, and we've definitely gone through a long process with this. So. So as Brooke mentioned, we did do an RFP process, and we were really surprised to see that we had 8 people respond, or 8 companies respond. We had local and U.S. companies respond to the city's RFP process, and in the end, we did choose a local builder. Mostly, we saw it as an opportunity to have some feedback before the units arrived on site. There was a bit more flexibility and could be responsive to the local needs that we see in Vancouver. And the design of the structures was really key. We were looking for prefabricated units to expedite the process, but we also recognized we wanted to make a few tweaks. So we were buying a product, essentially a prefab home, or shelter, sorry, but we wanted to have a little bit of input into the design. So next, we had to assemble our team. So once we had figured out that we were going to go ahead with this, we had to determine who would be our partners in going forward with this. Obviously, LUMA would be a partner. The project itself was led by our department, which is Homelessness Services. We are a social planning department, so we're not builders. We're not within the planning department, so I think that's an important distinction to be made here. So then we brought on a landscape architecture firm who's going to help with our site design, and they were a pre-qualified city vendor, so we recognized that they could help with the permits and the site design. And then we brought on, through our RFP process, our local builder. But the builder was only going to do part of that project. They were just going to bring the prefab shelter to the site, and we wanted to have decks and stoops and a bit of site design, including picnic tables, so we had to have a different contractor for that. So we were just going to bring them on. We had someone else who was going to electrify the tiny shelters, so plug them into the existing shelter. And then we also had an external consultant for project evaluation, as this is a pilot project. We really wanted to have them along board through the whole process. So they were brought on, our consultant was brought on in the initial stages. And as we learned throughout the process, this was our initial project team. It did change, and it actually grew significantly, which we'll get into. So being a city-led project, we knew that we were going to have a little bit of things to navigate in terms of a regulatory process. We knew that there would be requirements that could be a barrier to getting this project off the ground, as it was the first of its kind in Vancouver, and it didn't really fit any of our bylaws. So it didn't fit into a mold, and was really a process with our internal departments, kind of having discussions with our chief building official, our permitting folks, the Vancouver Fire Department, because no one really knew how it should work. And so it was a really collaborative process with other city departments. And we've really worked all along with these departments, and I think that's part of the thing that was surprising, that it was not a decision that was made. It was an ongoing process. So as these structures are 10 by 10 under our Vancouver building bylaw, they're not normally required to have permits. But because of our use, having people sleeping in them, both fire and our chief building official were worried about meeting safety requirements so that people were safe in the shelters. So out of that came the decision that at first we didn't think we were going to need permits for these, and then it turned that we would have to, so it kind of changed our process a little bit. And then with our discussions with the fire department also led to decisions that needed to be made around what fire measures were going to be put in place. One of the things that we did talk about was having sprinklers, because in all of our shelters, sprinklers are required, but that was going to be cost prohibitive to us, and the tiny shelters themselves are not connected to a water source, so that was a real roadblock at one point in the project. We ended up meeting the fire department halfway with a lot of safety measures in place. So all of the tiny shelters will be connected to the main fire panel and the main shelters, so the shelter staff will be monitoring that. We also have visual strobe lights on the outside of the tiny shelters, so that if the alarms go off inside the tiny shelter, we can also see what's going on. So people in the parking lot using it could also know that was going on. So these are a way that we met Vancouver Fire's requirements without having to get them sprinklered. And I'll pass it over to Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you, Brooke and Mary Ellen. And thank you for all of that process. It definitely a challenge with lots of learning lessons along the way, but here we are. You know, we're so close to rolling this project out and serving a historically underserved population in sheltering. So just going to talk a bit about the choice for this particular lot. So as was mentioned, Illuminative Housing Society currently operates an 80-bed shelter out of a commercial lot, city-owned commercial lot in partnership with the City of Vancouver as well as BC Housing, serving the unsheltered community, the unhoused community in that specific area, as well as the areas at large, significantly well. It being in a commercial designated area, there's not residents and residential sort of considerations to really factor into that specific equation. It was mentioned in the previous chat about public and sort of public input influencing the ultimate rollout of affordable and supportive housing projects. Those considerations were a lot less here, due from the folks that are in and around the area. One big selling feature of the selection of this specific site and the location of it, a grossly underutilized parking lot, huge parking lot we've had in this shelter since it's been in operations for 2.5 years or so, and a very practical use of this specific space. So we were eager and excited to jump in and start putting these pieces together. I've already chatted a bit about that it's connected to the existing shelter in a really big underutilized parking lot. So to find a practical use for underutilized space, especially in these dire times of a significant lack of housing options, period, was embraced by City of Vancouver Illuminative Housing Society to endeavor this project and roll it out in as expeditious of a manner as we possibly could. It's already been mentioned so this is a site layout and design. You'll see it was rolled out in efforts of creating that community. So our goal here was to create a community that would tap into our, sorry. I got lots of nerves and lots of anxiety right now. So bear with me. Thank you, Mary Ellen. So the intent of this was to roll out the community vibe and the community feel. So Illuminative Housing Society, as an organization, our goal is to connect those we serve with community and culture in connections and reconnections. So a lot of consideration was put out into this specific design and layout of the 10 tiny shelters that are now on site in that parking lot, with areas for congregation, some amazing light up points, and just that community vibe and feel, tapping into the community that's already in place at our larger shelter found in the commercial area right behind us. Every unit is 100 square feet. I believe Brooke had already mentioned that. Now we're going to roll into our operational plan. And you can see right here a really, really cool picture of the tiny shelters in construction. Noting that, on completion, obviously it'll have, I shouldn't say obviously, it'll have more of that community vibe and that community feel, positively impacting those that'll inevitably be served in these shelters, with the picnic benches and the cool lighting features. I think there's, at the very least, the picnic benches and some very cool lighting features going to create that sense and vibe of community. So 10 units, all with different configurations. We've got three of the units that have 2 double beds in it. We've got 5 of the units with single beds, 3 units with 2 single beds in it. My apologies, I'm going to confuse this. 5 units with 2 double beds and then 2 accessible units. The really cool part about these design and the ability to sort of tweak and edit and modify standardized tiny shelter design that we got was the ability to serve an underserved or a demographic of folk that's just historically not served in conjunction, in unison. Couples was the biggest part that we noted we could serve. We now had an option. We will soon have an option to serve couples sheltering together in their same safe space. That coupled with, it was mentioned, unromantic friends, family, community. So family, providing family and community members the ability to shelter together is something that I don't see in Vancouver in what we currently afford. Couples, the ability to shelter together. Again, options I just don't see. So it's really exciting, the ability to be able to serve couples an option to shelter together in their own safe space. And this is another amazingly cool part of this specific project, is it's connected and essentially rolled out as an extension of our current 80-bed shelter, which is found in that commercial space right off of the parking lot right there. So you'll notice there's trailers there. Those trailers encompass showers, both accessible and regular use showers, as well as toilets. Again, both accessible and regular use toilets. So all of the day-to-day facilities, laundry, you see the washer dryer set up there, all of the amenities that are afforded to those that we serve in our larger shelter are 100% afforded to those in this tiny shelter community that we built in the parking lot, coupled with all of the programming and services we roll out. Again, the Illuminative Housing Society's core focus being the connection and reconnection to community and culture, and the barrage of services we provide in that regard. Talking circles, access to elders, smudging ceremony. We have quarterly. We've got seasonal celebrations. We celebrate the equinox, spring, fall, winter, and summer. And oddly enough, or not oddly enough, coolly enough, all of those celebrations occur at this specific shelter. So just going for that bigger, larger community community effect, vibe, and impact. We're hopeful that it'll have an amazing impact overall. Mary Ellen?
So with all the considerations of meeting the needs of the population that we want to serve, we had a lot of flexibility with our builder, which really worked out well. They were flexible in the prefab design, which was part of our choice with the RFP process. So you'll see in one of the photos there that there's a little table that's popping up and down that can be shared between the beds. There's, as Kevin mentioned, the regular traditional shelter has storage, so we wanted to have 2 bins under the beds that would match the same model in the shelter. There was talk of where the heater should go. Should it go on one side, but then will there be, potential conflict between people who are staying in the tiny shelters? So the builder really worked with us to have these modifications and considerations along the way. So it's sort of like a prefab process with them. And built into the process, we, as I mentioned before, we have an evaluator who will be looking at the project as a total at the end and both throughout the process. So our consultants will interview shelter guests, both in the tiny shelters as well as the traditional shelter, to compare and contrast their experiences. Some of the questions will be like to folks staying in the tiny shelters, what they like about it, what they might improve about it, and how staying in a tiny shelter might be different from shelters that they'd accessed in the past. So to really get a user experience and see if this is something that we want to pilot further. We will also provide honorariums for folks who are staying and being interviewed. We're going to be interviewing LUMA's frontline staff and maintenance staff to see how it's working for them, and also see how the structures are holding up, because we know that the use on them, that was something we worked in with the builder, is to really try and have materials that aren't easily damaged and would stand the test of time, really. And as it's a temporary pilot project, they do have the ability to be moved if ever we weren't able to be on that city-owned lot again. We would want to be able to move them. And then, of course, we'll also have interviews with city staff involved, so VPD and the permitting folks, our staff, our architects that we inevitably had to hire, which I'll get into. And as part of our team evaluation, in BC there are a few tiny shelter villages in other parts, and we've talked about, Brooke, Kevin, and I, about going to visit those as part of our evaluation process and see how they work, because ours is connected with a shelter. Some of the other ones in Victoria, it's a different model, so we really would like to compare with those municipalities and places. So now I'll get into our endless lessons learned. The process has been a little bit like this afternoon has been, with, just everything comes at you, and we've had to pivot a lot of time. I would say this is our juicy stuff. This is what we've learned. So we had a few different subcategories, unfortunately, of lessons learned. So we have municipal challenges and builder challenges. So our municipal challenges have been at the electrical, with some of the electrical. The existing shelter has a specific electrical load, and we were having to make some modifications with the fire safety measures. This added to the electrical load that the tiny shelters would require, and we've landed on having a small electrical contingency, but at one point it was pretty touch and go as to whether we were actually going to be able to do this without getting additional BC Hydro infrastructure, which would have added a year and a half to the project. So we dodged a bullet there, but it was we weren't sure if it was going to keep going. And we also, having to plug into the main site, we had to make a slight modification to the building envelope by drilling into the main shelter. We were drilling into lead-based paint, which then we had to have a hazardous building assessment, and we got many different other city departments involved, which wasn't initially thought about. We also ran into a few product issues. Because it was prefab, we would have something delivered on site and it would be all ready to go. The builder traditionally makes 12 by 8 structures, and ours are 10 by 10. And they had a little bit of problems getting it out of the warehouse, so they had to be shipped in parts. And then there was construction on site, which then turned the site into an active construction site. So we ran into a few things with WCB. So there was hence a change in the project management, and our project team grew. So we initially started, was based in homelessness services, and through this we had to add a colleague from real estate and facilities management who technically I guess own that city building, and they became involved. We also had to add an architect because of various permitting issues. The architect had to sign off on all of the work, the electrical work, everything like that. So it was just an additional person. We also then had to add, because of the WorkSafe issue, we had to add a construction management company. And this, luckily for us, the city does have a large retainer with a large construction company, and they were able to pivot and join us on our very small construction project, because neither Brooke or I are construction managers, so it wasn't going to work out. We're not going to wear those hats and walk in, and so it was definitely a learning. It was a very small purchase of a product that turned into basically a design build situation. And then Brooke, I'll turn it over to you for.
Okay, so you heard a little bit about our challenges from the municipal perspective. There was also some from the builder's perspective, sort of builder challenges. You've heard about the prefab to design build already. We were working with a very small local contractor, and so with that comes, like, the size of this project was something that they weren't typically used to. So access to the funding, cash flow issues actually became a little bit of an issue. So as you will know, municipal processes are such that you don't get the payments super quickly, like tomorrow. And often they needed the funding very quickly so that they could just continue on with the project. So it was something we hadn't anticipated up front. They were experienced in their work, but not this scale of work. So really important lessons for us and them. And we did everything we could on our end around, for example, taking the Net 30 away and looking for payments to be expedited within our very bureaucratic systems. And so, we just kind of kept chugging along. But certainly there were moments where, at least a couple times, I would say, we had to wait, or they had to wait before they could do their next piece, because it literally meant funding to go purchase products. The costs obviously increased. We can talk a bit more about that. While we did have a contingency built in to the project, we've exceeded that. What else did I want to share? Some of the pros around lessons learned. One of the reasons, we worked with LUMA to pick the actual proponent, the request for proposals process. We did it together. And one of the things that stuck out to us early on was really and hopefully you get a sense here, but really the non-institutional feel of these. You can purchase these pop-up boxes, and that's fine, nothing against those companies at all, but I think as a municipality, with our partners, it was really important to us to pick something that people would want to come to. As was said, this is populations who are not accessing services. So what could we do to make it as friendly as possible, and so that non-institutional feel, that sense of kind of a home, even if it's a shelter, was really important to us. So that was definitely a plus with working with a local builder. And just the relationship management. Everybody was so vested, the builder, ourselves as partners, all of the project team that were brought on, everybody was really wanting to be part of this solution. So that was a plus, 100%. And weekly meetings, project meetings, and the rest of that. So just in the interest of time, I'll keep moving. So we talked about, should we put a timeline slide? And we decided this would not fit on one slide in terms of how the project was supposed to go and, how much time it has taken so far. It was interesting in the market sounding. Early on in the process, it was, the suggestion was it's anywhere between 12 weeks to 6 months to get to implementation of this type of a project. Well, we've clearly exceeded that. And I think you've heard a little bit about that. So the current completion schedule is meant to be end of this month. So initially, when we submitted this proposal, we thought we would have, about 4, maybe 5 months of actually operational time to share with you all as well. So that part you can, get in touch with us if you're interested to hear how it played out. And then lastly, I'll just pass it back to Kevin to talk a little bit about the referral process. How can folks actually access the tiny shelters? Okay.
Thank you, Brooke. And I just want to thank you. I touch really quickly on the inclusive process that the city had ventured out with other partners, Luma Native Housing Society, and the selection of the vendor and every sort of step and process along the way. It's been an amazing experience, a very inclusive, a very warm, a very welcoming process. Again, outside of that cold, typical, standardized, structured process where you got very firm perimeters to work with, and allowances were afforded all over the place in efforts of just giving this project that warm vibe, that warm feel, in efforts of the end product sort of impacting in that community vibe and sense. So thank you, City of Vancouver, for all of that. It was an amazing experience all around, despite all of the banging of our toes along the way. So I'll just talk briefly about the referral process. Coming together is the core of it. So we've got the City of Vancouver's outreach team, Carnegie Outreach, coupled with Luma Native Housing Society's outreach team, coming together on a consistent basis with referrals specifically for this tiny shelter process in a circle setting, taking into factors in consideration safety, emotional, physical safety factors, needs-based factors, not having a standardized wait list, so to speak. It's the idea, I believe, is to be sheltered in a needs-based situation and scenario by coming together, the city and Luma as operators, identifying those in need, and then getting those sheltered that need it in the moment. A holistic approach, to say the least. So the initial set of folks, those talks are currently in process to identify those that we're going to inevitably shelter, and then on an ongoing basis, just with regular meetings, again, both the outreach teams coming together with both the respective names of referrals that are being sought to get referred into these specific units based off of the availability, and on a regular basis. Very basic, very simple, trying not to complicate a process. And that's all I've got to talk about on referrals. Yeah, okay, so thank you so much. So you'll notice all of our context up here on the screen. You got any questions, feel free to send us an email. And thank you so much.
Great, yeah, thank you very much, Brooke, Marilyn, and Kevin, that was great. Sure, if there's you have questions, I can circulate with a microphone. Thank you, I appreciate that so much. There's a few hands.
Yeah, we're going to get them all in order.
Yes. Thank you. No, if you don't mind, just because it is being streamed as well. Yeah. My technology limit ends with getting this up. Come on.
Can I ask you then one of the presenters can repeat it?
Yes.
Check.
LUMA is amazing. I got to learn from y'all when we started to look into harm reduction at Covenant House. So just thank you so much. And from that, my question is two parts. One, how did you get all the photos not overcast? The blue sky is not correct. But also, do you take parents with children? And if so, does that is that the standard that MCFD needs to maintain parental care? This is a complicated question. I'm sorry.
No, and can you hear me? Yeah, no. So I par for the basically the extension of our shelter. It is a 19-plus serving facility. So by families, it's any parent with an adult child, or any couple of friends that have sort of supported each other in their specific walk and path and have wound up needing this specific type of service. So no MCFD involvement, unfortunately, just due to the complexities of that specific situation. Don't get me wrong, it's a needed area, 100% it is, and we've made steps and strides in other supportive housing programs to include the sheltering of children within that specific environment, but not there yet for the shelter.
Okay, here's the big question. How much did it cost? Hard costs and soft costs as well, all in.
I knew that would come up. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. So what was approved at council was 1.5 million, and I'll break that down for you. So it was 460,000 for the capital side. So taking in all the costs of building each of those, that would be like 46,000 per tiny shelter structure, including all of the servicing costs and all of that, not just literally building the structure. 500,000 in operating dollars for 2 years. I forgot to mention it was approved as a 2-year pilot. So council approved 500,000 per year. Now that's actually not bad, as you all know. It's because we could leverage the existing programming, existing staff at the congregate shelter as well. We also built in, as Mary Ellen had shared, 20,000 for evaluation costs, and then learning from some other modular supportive housing sites in the city, we also built in about 15,000 for if the pilot was to end at that site, could it be packed up and moved somewhere else? So we built in a cost for that, and then contingency as well.
I'll just add, one of the things that in Vancouver, the city is not generally involved in funding of shelters, so this is something different that we're taking on in funding LUMA to operate, I guess.
Yeah, in BC, it's provincial responsibility.
Yeah, no, the shelter as a whole is funded through BC Housing, so there's an extension of that funding through the City of Vancouver, which is a really cool, unique sort of path and process to be involved in to roll out,
I think in every community, sheltering couples is one of the biggest challenges. Question, do you guys have like a plan if those relationships fall apart? If you're housing a couple and that falls apart, how are you going to deal with who goes and who stays? Or do they both go?
It would definitely be situational dependent, but this is where the added benefit and bonus of having a congregate shelter right attached to the property. So we've got access to beds where maybe necessarily nobody has to go. Maybe it's just, affording one partner a bed on one side of the dorm and another partner a bed on the other side of the dorm. We've got options that are definitely open and available to us. If it boils right down to it, again, it's situational dependent, right? But we've got tons of options with the 80 beds that we currently already have on site. So excited to get in and get some practicals,
I'll call you in 6 months.
I love it, for sure.
Hi.
So when you were in the planning process of this, as far as the community, the population that aren't homeless, people living in the community and local businesses in the community, did you face any backlash towards putting that there? And if so, how did you guys combat that and kind of get people on your side to support it or get on board with it?
We've been extremely lucky because there's an existing shelter in an industrial area. We've actually, our challenge has been like being asked by council, why haven't this been delivered yet? So that has been our sort of major barrier as the city, but we definitely are no stranger to opposition with shelters. So it's just one of the things that's been really fortuitous with this site is that the shelter was already there and we didn't have a lot of opposition because of where the shelter is located.
And we did the community notification as well as part of the municipal process, yeah.
And I just want to add on the support from the folks already providing services in the area was largely overwhelmingly positive. There was, and it was really unique, or not unique. It was I don't say lucky, but it was cool that we had opened up the shelter previous to this tiny shelter project in an area where there was a significant unhoused population already, right? So just having options to serve that population already there, it had a positive impact for the neighborhood as a whole.
Just, I guess, another question for the tiny team, big tiny team.
Nice.
So I spent a lot of time on the question of what is a reasonable square foot for somebody to habitate in. And so I'm curious how you landed on 100 square feet. You know, I've looked at single room occupancy hotels, rooming houses, bachelors, the whole bit. So I'm curious on that. And then just a question too for presenter one. In the study, I was just curious if any of the respondents noted any encampments that had municipal infrastructure sort of extended, whether it was just electricity, water, garbage pickup, or anything. I'm just curious on that. So 2 questions, square foot and then infrastructure.
Should I go ahead? So that's a really great question. We have a lot of experience in Vancouver around single room occupancy accommodations, and we see how often tenants are not successful, and a lot of it has to do with the size of the units, ability to have guests. So, and there's, not the common areas available to them. So, the market sounding, there was 60 square feet. There was, the builder themselves was 96 square feet. So we just thought, we're going to push the envelope to what is allowable within our, give a little bit more space, and then what's allowable within our code, like the municipal process that Mary Ellen talked about in terms of it not being. We ended up going through all the permitting processes in the end, but initially it was like, okay, 100 square feet is a little bit more space, and also we should be able to do this a little bit quicker. That part didn't work out, but we were curious to see, hopefully having a bit more space would help people be more successful. Oh, sorry. Yes.
And just to double check, so you're asking if any communities reported the municipality providing direct support for infrastructure within encampments, be it water or electricity, heating, any. Yeah, so there were quite a few communities that did say that the municipality was an active participant in, say, solid waste disposal, pest control services, and were coordinating with frontline service providers or with emergency services to provide those basic survival needs to live in dignity and within an encampment in a consistent manner. I'm not entirely sure logistically if I can't recall any comments about specifically electrical infrastructure. Not off the top of my head for that one.
Thanks so much for the great presentation. Oh, yeah, I'm over here.
Thank you.
That was a great presentation. I'm LaTanya from The Shift. I had a quick comment and then what I hope will be a question, but we shall see how that goes. So a comment that's related to the issue of encampments, because Mayor Savage, during the beginning opening session, mentioned something called the Municipal Engagement Guidance that the National Working Group on Homeless Encampments created, which is convened by The Shift. It's essentially a national consensus standard on how municipalities should be addressing and engaging with encampments in line with human rights. I have a couple of copies. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. But my question is related to the topic of shelters, because I've noticed in a lot of the conversations that we're having about homelessness and homeless encampments, shelters, which are supposed to be an emergency response, become the focal point of policy intervention. And I recognize that cities across Canada are using such innovative and new approaches to address a really difficult crisis, one that they don't have the capacity and the resources to address adequately without federal and provincial support. But I've gone to tiny shelter communities, one in particular, where operators are doing an amazing job with trying to provide essential services to those in need. But unfortunately, those individuals are not going anywhere. There's no affordable housing for them. There's no place for them outside of that shelter. So I'm wondering if all these resources and tools that we're using, how we can use them to actually create the affordable housing that we need. And worried also about when we're taking emergency responses and trying to make them into permanent solutions, when we know that I personally wouldn't want to live in a shelter. I would want someone that's living in homelessness to have to be that's their only option. So I just wanted to put that into the conversation as well, not to take away from the amazing work that you are all doing, but just wanted to put that in the pipeline as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I thank you for actually bringing that point into the conversation. I think, it's really important to remember that increasing shelter use is not our goal, or increasing shelter reliance is not our goal. Housing, framing housing as a fundamental human right, recognizing that it is a fundamental human right and integrating that into policy responses at every level, I think is really important. I think that in terms of encampments, the big takeaway that I had from the survey responses was that, especially exacerbated by the impacts of the pandemic, people were finding that, the services that are meant to connect them with trajectories to permanent housing were, maybe they had associations of, trauma with those services. So I think there's sort of a question of making sure that those services are accessible and appropriate in the first place so that people can engage safely, and then keeping in mind that it isn't the end goal. But yeah, I think it's a really, really great contribution. So also, could you actually repeat the title of the report that you have?
It's called the Municipal Engagement Guidance.
Okay, Municipal Engagement Guidance. Okay.
Can I just add a quick comment as well? Thank you. Yeah, it's a big, important policy question. Ideally, it's still an emergency response as a gateway to housing. And even in the congregate shelters, we have folks who are staying for a very long time because we're not, the housing, as we know, is not coming quickly enough. But yeah, it's an important thing to keep an eye on for sure. The intent is that our outreach teams collectively still work with folks to access housing through a coordinated access approach.
Hi. Three questions, two for the team and one for Michelle. The evaluation, in your evaluation of the costs, was there any evaluation of the positive or beneficial impact on service, whether hospital services, ER visits, so on and so forth? In other words, as people are into something a little bit more stable than tents or sleeping in the rough, any in the effect in other services? And secondly, I noticed in some of the pictures, I'm assuming they were being, some of them were being assembled indoors, but is this something that could work in a space where you could have, instead of outdoor units, maybe it's indoor units in, whether it's a vacant shopping center or, you know, along those lines, so that it's indoors, it saves on the heating, and you got other facilities in there. That's the first. Second thing. So I'm just curious as to what your thoughts on that. And Michelle, for you, you made a reference to the fact that in wintertime, the encampments, they decline, the numbers decline. I guess the question I'd ask is, any indication where they go? I'm assuming they might go indoors, but they might not. They might go, maybe they're going to more sheltered areas, I don't know. But those are 3 questions I have. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's a really good question about the evaluation piece. So from what I'm remembering, I didn't bring the framework with me, but it would be self-reported by the shelter guests in terms of their health outcomes. So we wouldn't actually like check in with the Vancouver Coastal Health to see if their use, for example, of hospitals has decreased. But our plan is to check in monthly and do a little checkpoint. The evaluator will check in with the individuals. So we're hoping we'll get some learnings. Yeah, it's a great question.
And I guess with regards to your second question about moving them indoors, I mean, as Kevin pointed out in one of our slides, actually in the shelter that is co-located there, we had to do a workaround when we actually built the shelter to put the toilet infrastructure in. Like you saw, there was actually ATCO trailers. So that was a workaround because of the slab within the industrial building. So we hooked those into the sewer system above ground, so they're actually lifted. So I think if there is space, you could probably put the tiny shelters within an industrial building. Depends on the regulatory process in your municipality. And of course, we're under the pressure of creating more shelter beds per space. Like, so this is something that we're trying, a new model, because it's not working for everyone. But I know that there traditionally is pressure from funders to have more beds per square foot. So that could be something that might be a barrier as well. But let's try it. Let's try anything, right?
And to your last question about the seasonal changes in encampments, communities added some comments. So this is not, I don't have any like hard statistics, but I do recall that, communities would report often that, like, weather permitting, people in their community would not interact with services. So sort of as, you know, weather gets harsher and necessitates, minimizing exposure to the elements, then they are forced to go to shelter as recourse to encampment. So then that was sort of an indicator that, you know, there's either a broken trust or something happening in terms of the appropriateness of the shelter. Like there's a trade-off that people are making. But I think that there's also, there could be also rises in hidden homelessness during the winter that we wouldn't be able to measure, or I can't think of a way for us to measure that. And another thing that is, I think, important to note is that, like, we don't have a great body of research currently on, or I'm not aware of a great body of research on, like, mortality and unsheltered homelessness, but I might suspect that there, you know, would be severe health repercussions to sleeping outside through a Canadian winter. So the decrease could be changes in service provision, the types of services being provided over the course of the year. Communities also open special, winter, cold weather shelters or warming centers. So that might reduce the incidence or the prevalence of encampment homelessness, but it could be a number of factors. And I think that that would be a really interesting area to sort of continue to look into. Yeah.
And I just wanted to jump in and sort of piggyback what Brooke had mentioned and sort of add that getting an individual sheltered in efforts of providing wraparound multidisciplinary services, inclusive of health and social and community services, I can't help but see, the results being positive and the strain on the system, the engagement on the system as a whole in the emergency sense just lessen. We've got some very, very much so firsthand experiences in that regard. I don't have any statistics with me, unfortunately, but our experience is that 100%, the ability to serve folks where they're at, with that at their point of shelter, at their point of residence, definitely assists an individual on a different path in its entirety altogether.
Hopefully an easy answer to my question. If I heard correctly, there's no provision for cooking in these mini shelters or small shelters. Does LUMA Shelter provide the food that these individuals will be eating?
Wait, 100%. So LUMA has managed to, we provide access to food 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if an individual's hungry, they go to the office and they will get food, whether it be in the form of our fruit or a protein, in the form of a frozen good, or we have a variety of food options. We also provide at least one hot meal daily, which is prepared off-site and delivered to the shelter. So every single guest at that shelter will get at least one hot meal daily. Usually we prepare a cold breakfast or have a prepared oatmeal breakfast of some sort. Some days we do pancake meals with our, don't tell the city, we're not supposed to cook there. We do some light cooking, right? No, we fought good and hard with our funders, BC Housing, to get an adequate food budget to provide folks access to food 24 hours a day, just essentially removing that desperation point, right? You put food in an individual's tummy, it changes the game. So yeah, food all the time.
We have time for one last question, maybe two if we're fast.
Sorry, I had the microphone already. Okay. I'm curious about, because it's co-located with an existing shelter and you're targeting folks that are typically not accessing shelter services in the community, I'm curious if that has, if people are buying in and if that's been a hindrance. And my other curiosity is around harm reduction and what that would look like in the tiny little shelters.
So we don't anticipate it being problematic or there being any pushback by those intended to be served at this very cool, very unique model that's being rolled out. It's not practically in operations yet, so we're excited to get in there and see how it's going to be received by the intended folks that'll end up sheltering there. We are a harm reduction shelter, so 100% we've got and I think it's the old term, my apologies, the housing overdose prevention site. So we've got built into the congregate shelter an area where folks can actively use, it's on camera, it's a place that all of the guests know as a point to use. You can use safe there, that somebody will see you if you overdose. We have all the harm reduction supplies appropriately and accordingly supplied as wanted or as needed. Yeah, harm reduction is totally the model we follow.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I just want to, do we have one more? Yes.
Sorry.
Just get the microphone, yeah.
Is there a timeline for stay in the shelter? Like one person can stay up to X amount of time?
Yeah, so we don't have time limits on our stays at shelters. What we do have in place is bi-weekly key worker meetings with every individual guest we serve, carving out a specific path and plan based on the individual's wants or the individual's needs as determined by the individual that we're serving. And if that particular plan encompasses a housing or a different option, we will certainly walk down that path of inevitable housing or whatever option or path folks are requesting for us to walk with them down. No timelines short of it.
Great, thank you very much. Please join me in, yes, Michelle. Great presentations. Their contact information is on the slides. It's probably, I think it's available through the app. You can reach out as well. So thanks again. It was really informative. Thanks again for the participation. There is a social happening as well right now. So if you wanted to go to the main room, the social is happening there. Thank you.